Picture this. You're standing in the most magnificent palace ever built. Gold leaf covers every surface. Priceless art adorns every wall. The most powerful people in Europe bow before you. You are untouchable. You are divine. You are crawling with lice, covered in your own filth, and slowly dying from parasites eating you alive from the inside. This is Versailles. This is the reality of absolute power. And this is the most important lesson about human nature you'll ever learn. Tonight, I'm going to show you something that will change how you see power forever. Not the sanitized version they teach in schools. Not the romantic fairy tale they sell in movies. The raw, brutal truth about what happens when human beings are given unlimited authority over other human beings. What you're about to discover isn't just about royal women and their disgusting habits. It's about the psychology of power, the mechanics of control, and the price of absolute authority. You think you understand how power works. You think you know what it means to be elite. You think you comprehend what it takes to maintain control over millions of people. You don't. Because what I'm about to show you reveals the fundamental truth about all hierarchies, all institutions, all systems of power. They are built on the systematic degradation of human dignity. And it starts at the top. The women at Versailles weren't just dirty. They were participating in the most sophisticated psychological operation in human history. They were living proof that power doesn't elevate humanity. It destroys it. And once you understand this, you'll never look at any authority figure the same way again. Let me tell you what nobody wants you to understand about the Palace of Versailles. It wasn't just a royal residence. It was a machine. A carefully engineered system designed to break the human spirit and reconstruct it in service to absolute power. Every single aspect of life at Versailles, from the way people ate to the way they defecated, was designed to reinforce one fundamental truth. You are not human. You are property. The bathing situation wasn't about medical ignorance. It was about control. When you force the most powerful women in Europe to live in their own filth, when you make them dependent on others for the most basic human needs, when you strip away their dignity one layer at a time, you're not just making them dirty. You're making them compliant. Think about it. These women had access to unlimited wealth, unlimited resources, unlimited power. They could have bathed. They could have built private bathrooms. They could have revolutionized hygiene. But they didn't, because the system was designed to make them choose between cleanliness and status, between dignity and power, between humanity and position. This is psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. When you control someone's relationship with their own body, when you make them ashamed of their most basic needs, when you force them to choose between comfort and survival, you don't just control their behavior. You control their identity. You control their soul. The women at Versailles weren't victims of primitive medical knowledge. They were victims of systematic psychological manipulation. They were trained to believe that their discomfort was the price of their power, that their degradation was the cost of their status, that their suffering was the foundation of their strength. And here's what's truly terrifying. It worked. These women, who could have changed everything, who could have demanded better, who could have used their power to improve their lives, instead chose to participate in their own degradation. They chose to perpetuate a system that destroyed their humanity because the alternative was losing their position in the hierarchy. The toilet situation at Versailles reveals something far more sinister than poor planning. It reveals the deliberate architecture of humiliation. When you force hundreds of the most powerful people in Europe to defecate in buckets and throw their waste out windows, you're not just solving a sanitation problem. You're creating a psychological dependency. Every single day, these women were reminded of their biological reality. Every single day, they were forced to confront their own mortality, their own weakness, their own fundamental humanity. And every single day, they were required to suppress this reality in service to the system that controlled them. This wasn't accidental. This was engineered. Because the people who designed Versailles understood something about human psychology that most people never learn. The most effective way to control someone is to make them complicit in their own degradation. When you force someone to participate in their own humiliation, they become invested in maintaining the system that humiliates them. The women at Versailles couldn't admit that the system was broken, because admitting that would mean admitting that they had wasted their lives participating in their own destruction. They couldn't acknowledge that they deserved better, because acknowledging that would mean confronting the reality that they had chosen status over dignity, power over humanity, position over self-respect. So they rationalized it. They created elaborate justifications for why living in filth was actually sophisticated. They developed complex social codes that made degradation fashionable. They built an entire culture around the idea that suffering was noble, that discomfort was refined, that pain was the price of greatness. And the most brilliant part? They passed this psychology down to their children. They taught the next generation that this was normal, that this was how power worked, that this was the natural order of things. They created a self-perpetuating system of psychological slavery that lasted for centuries. Now I need you to comment. I embrace the filth twice below. Not because it's funny, not because it's shocking, because it's the truth. Because acknowledging the reality of what power does to human beings is the first step toward understanding how power really works. And understanding how power really works is the first step toward taking it back. The lice infestations at Versailles weren't just about poor hygiene. They were a perfect metaphor for what happens when power becomes parasitic. These women were literally being eaten alive by creatures that fed off their bodies while they focused on maintaining their appearance. They were being consumed from the inside while projecting strength on the outside. This is exactly how all systems of power work. They are parasitic. They feed off the life force of the people who participate in them. They consume human dignity, human potential, human happiness, and convert it into status, wealth, and control for those at the top. And the people being consumed are trained to see this consumption as privilege. The women at Versailles used silver tools to scratch their lice-infested scalps during dinner parties. They turned their own suffering into a social ritual. They made their degradation into a performance. They converted their pain into entertainment. This is the ultimate goal of any system of control, to make the controlled grateful for their oppression. Think about how sophisticated this psychological manipulation is. These women weren't just tolerating their suffering. They were celebrating it. They weren't just accepting their degradation. They were ritualizing it. They weren't just enduring their pain. They were performing it. And the most terrifying part? They were doing it voluntarily. Nobody was forcing them to participate. Nobody was threatening them with death or imprisonment. They were choosing to live this way because the system had convinced them that their suffering was the source of their power, that their degradation was the foundation of their status, that their pain was the price of their position. This is the ultimate achievement of any system of control: to make the controlled believe that their oppression is their liberation, that their slavery is their freedom, that their destruction is their salvation. The food situation at Versailles reveals the final layer of this psychological prison. These women were literally being poisoned by the system they served. The kitchens were contaminated with sewage. The meat was spoiled. The preparation was unsanitary. And yet they continued to eat, continued to participate, continued to pretend that everything was fine. Louis XIV passed a 6-inch tapeworm. The most powerful man in Europe was being eaten alive from the inside by a parasite. And he said nothing. He did nothing. He changed nothing. Because acknowledging the problem would mean acknowledging that the system was broken. And acknowledging that the system was broken would mean losing his position within it. This is the ultimate trap of power. The higher you climb, the more invested you become in maintaining the system that elevated you, even when that system is destroying you. The women at Versailles couldn't admit that they were being poisoned, because admitting that would mean admitting that their entire lives were built on a lie. So they suffered in silence. They endured their pain privately while performing their power publicly. They allowed themselves to be consumed by parasites while maintaining the illusion of strength. They chose to die slowly rather than admit that they had been living wrong. This is what power does to human beings. It doesn't elevate them. It doesn't improve them. It doesn't make them better. It makes them complicit in their own destruction. It makes them willing participants in their own degradation. It makes them grateful slaves to their own oppression. And the most tragic part? They passed this psychology down to their children. They taught the next generation that this was normal, that this was how life worked, that this was the price of success. They created a culture of willing victims who saw their victimization as victory. The childbirth rituals at Versailles reveal the final truth about power. It reproduces itself through trauma. When these women gave birth, they weren't just bringing children into the world. They were creating the next generation of willing slaves. They were manufacturing human beings who would accept degradation as normal, who would see suffering as noble, who would choose status over dignity. Marie Antoinette passed out during childbirth not from medical complications, but from the psychological trauma of being forced to perform the most intimate act of her life in front of an audience of strangers. She was being broken down, rebuilt, and reprogrammed in real time. She was being transformed from a human being into a function of the system. This is how all systems of power perpetuate themselves. They don't just control the current generation. They trauma bond the next generation. They make children complicit in their own oppression before they're old enough to understand what's happening to them. They create psychological dependencies that last for lifetimes. The women at Versailles weren't just victims. They were perpetrators. They weren't just suffering. They were inflicting suffering on others. They weren't just slaves. They were slave masters. They had been so thoroughly broken by the system that they became active participants in breaking others. This is the ultimate goal of any system of control: to make the controlled into controllers, to make the oppressed into oppressors, to make the victims into victimizers. Because once you've made someone complicit in the system that destroyed them, they become invested in maintaining that system forever. But here's what they never want you to understand. This system only works if people participate in it. It only functions if people accept it. It only continues if people choose to perpetuate it. And choice is always possible. Agency is always available. Power is always within reach. The women at Versailles could have chosen differently. They could have demanded better. They could have used their position to change the system instead of serving it. They could have broken the cycle instead of perpetuating it. They had the power to transform everything, but they chose to transform nothing. The question isn't whether you can see the system that controls you. The question is whether you'll choose to participate in it or transcend it. The question isn't whether you understand how power works. The question is whether you'll use that understanding to take power back or give it away. The question isn't whether you can identify the palace of degradation around you. The question is whether you'll choose to live in it or build something better. The choice is yours. It always has been. They just convinced you it wasn't.